Rain made the boulevard shimmer as he pulled up in a black car, stepping into a house that had never needed permission. The kitchen light was on and a small shadow sat at the table with a bandage on his forehead. The maid stood by the sink with a towel draped over her hands, steady despite the day. He saw blood and his voice changed. An accusation slipped out before he had time to measure it. The maid explained calmly, she'd been in the garden trimming hedges, she'd heard a thump, found the boy on the stairs, helped him, put a towel to his head. Her words were plain, patient, like every merciful habit she'd kept in the house. He did not hear plain. He heard negligence and, under that, a suggestion that someone beneath him had failed the family's order. He marched to the assumption that fit his life. The woman who cooked and cleaned must also be the one who harmed. He called the police, certain that his money gave weight to his suspicion. Officers arrived, badges mild in the domestic light, questions clipped and efficient. The kitchen became a formal space where casual gestures acquired consequence. The officer took notes, another checked the boy's bandage and listened to the cadence of the room. The maid answered each question with the steady rhythm of someone who had carried responsibility without claiming credit. She had scrubbed the family stains for years and tucked small apologies into shirt sleeves. The boy watched, clutching his cereal bowl, then pushed back his chair and climbed onto his knees in front of the officer. He spoke with a candidness that belonged to children who had been taught that truth is sometimes the only defense. "I fell," he said. "I wanted the blue ball off the top shelf. Daddy told me not to climb. I did it anyway. The shelf broke. I hit my head. She put a towel on me and sang my song. She didn't hit me." The sentence rearranged the room. The billionaire's face tightened. For a blink he seemed less sure of the world. When a man has operated for a lifetime on the certainty that his assumptions reflect reality, a child's stubborn honesty can be corrosive. The officer asked routine questions. Who else was in the house? Had anyone been rough? Where had everyone been? The boy answered with small facts. The maid repeated her account. When asked if anyone in the home had ever hurt him, the boy hesitated as if measuring which truth would live. Then he said plainly and with the quiet weight of experience, "Sometimes when Daddy is tired he gets loud. One time he shook me because I wouldn't stop crying. She came in and sat with me until I could breathe." The confession landed like a note held too long. The billionaire's jaw worked. He had expected to wield certainty like a blunt instrument. Instead, the room reflected his uncertainty back at him. The maid's eyes filled but her voice stayed even. She had come to the house when the mother took a second job to make ends meet. Since then she had folded shirts, soothed fevers, and learned the small language of the child. The way his fingers curled when he felt safe, the turn of his head when he needed to be soothed. The officer's pen paused. He knew procedure: write the report, notify Child Protective Services, and arrange for medical records if needed. He also knew a less formal ledger, the one that collected neighborhood whispers and small reports. He called the welfare line and noted down names. For now, facts were king: the bruise, the boy's words, the maid's testimony. But facts rarely captured the interior of families. The billionaire bristled at the implication that he could have hurt his son. His protest had the sleek confidence of a man used to being believed. He demanded charges. He wanted the maid removed and his family's name clarified. The officer explained that accusations required investigation. A legal process would follow if warranted, but there was no immediate arrest. The mother arrived as the rain eased. She stepped inside with a travel bag and an exhausted smile that broke when she saw the cop and the tightened lines around her son's eyes. He ran to her, small limbs finding their orbit, and she gathered him with the slow, protective tenderness of someone who knew how fragile parenting could be under pressure. She listened as the maid narrated the afternoon and as the boy told his truth. The billionaire watched and, in watching, found himself face to face with consequences. He had come home certain he would assert authority. Instead, he discovered his certainty had been a misread of a child's accident. A flash of shame moved over him, not the shame of an injured parent only, but the deeper discomfort of someone who had pronounced guilt without hearing both sides. He said the words eventually, small and earnest. "I'm sorry," he told the maid. It was not a grand performance. It was clumsy and necessary, a man admitting a mistake that felt like losing money at a game he thought he could always win. The officer filed his report. Child Protective Services would visit. A pediatrician would check the boy carefully. The maid was not arrested. Instead, the family entered a process the way a boat enters a fog. Uncertain but underway. There would be questions about discipline and about boundaries, therapy referrals, and a slow mapping of what had already frayed. In the weeks that followed, the household's rhythm changed. The billionaire attended some counseling sessions with stiff patience that gradually became curiosity. He learned from a therapist how certain tones in his voice made the boy brace, how a raised hand, even if meant for emphasis rather than harm, could be terrifying to a small body. The maid remained part of the family's life but with new protections: scheduled days off, clearer expectations, and a contract that acknowledged emotional labor. Community gossip dwindled. What did not vanish was the work of fixing things that are not fixed by apologies alone. The boy began weekly play therapy, a room where he could draw dragons and then learn to tell the real dragons, fear and distrust, by name. The mother stayed close, sitting in sessions and learning language that softened commands into invitations. The billionaire had to relearn how to be present. He found that his wealth could buy a therapist's time and a school's best tutors, but the more subtle currency, his attention, could not be purchased. It had to be given. He practiced small acts, reading at dusk instead of issuing edicts, asking before correcting, learning to acknowledge when he had raised his voice. The maid, for her part, kept a careful watch over her boundary. She continued to tuck the boy in sometimes, to tuck notes of encouragement into his lunchbox when the mother asked, but she also began to save for a small apartment of her own. She loved the child as family, yes, but she also valued her dignity and safety. The family honored that choice with raises and time off, gestures that mattered because they acknowledged personhood rather than servitude. There were setbacks. Old habits returned during long work days and arguments about money. There were moments when the billionaire's temper flared and he had to call the therapist for a reminder. But the family had acquired language and resources to steer those flashes into repair instead of ruin. Over time, tiny rituals changed. During dinner, instead of a monologue about grades, the billionaire asked about favorite parts of the day and learned to answer when the boy hesitated. He met other fathers in therapy groups and heard how their hands shook when they felt small. He heard confessions about fear of losing control and saw how common pride can be a mask for helplessness. That recognition did not erase the past, but it kept him from repeating it. The maid joined a local community group for workers and received advice about contracts and legal protections she had never thought to ask for. The neighborhood's elderly woman who had vouched for her came by with a casserole and a note that read, simply, "Thank you." The maid framed it and put it on her little shelf, a quiet validation. The mother kept vigilant. At night she asked the boy to tell one good thing that happened that day and one thing that made him uncomfortable. They called these the good and the uncomfortable. When the uncomfortable was said, it did not metastasize into a lecture. Instead it was followed by a plan. Who to call, what to do, where to put the worry until morning. The boy learned that naming pain made it smaller. One afternoon, months after the kitchen incident, the boy sat on the billionaire's lap and asked why he had been so quick to blame. The billionaire thought about what to say and then said, "I was afraid. I didn't want to admit I could be wrong. I will try to be braver when I am uncertain." The boy nodded and then, with the blunt mercy of children, asked for another story about dragons. The billionaire obliged. He read awkwardly at first, stumbling over voices, but the boy laughed and corrected him, and soon the room rippled with something neither ledger nor lawyer could produce: a small, shared contentment. It was never a complete resolution. Real lives tend to be knotted. People spend years learning what to do with the threads. What changed was that the maid's humanity stopped being somewhere invisible, a background utility, and the child learned that his voice was a lever that opened doors. The billionaire learned that power without accountability is brittle, and the mother learned that protecting a child sometimes means changing the rules people take for granted. At the end of a long summer, the boys' class held a show and tell. He brought a drawing of a blue ball under a golden sun. The maid came as a guest and sat quietly at the back, smiling as every small triumph registered as another stitch in a life that had been frayed. The billionaire clapped with a tenderness that surprised himself. Afterwards, the family walked home together, not because everything was solved, but because they had chosen to stay and to keep listening. A thin sun finally threaded through the kitchen window one morning, painting the table in long gold. The boy drew his blue ball across the floor and the billionaire, watching quietly, smiled without a lecture. That single, soft gesture was not a triumph. It was an ordinary, fragile beginning.